Howdy-o and welcome to Rauta's Worst to Best videos. This time it's all about Swedish death metal. Or we could say melodic death metal, because in fact this is a band that, well, changed its style during the course of action. Very typical to happen with those older names that were trying to define whole genres or create something totally new. The band in question, Heads of Sanity. So let's tune in for Metal Archives for background while I'll guide you a little bit through this lost, forgotten gem of a death metal name. And it was very interesting for me to get back to this band. First, before I start going through their career and discography, I want to share you a little bit of my own story with the band. Now, when I encountered the band, I think the first release was Purgatory Africa around 1994. I was 19 of age, roughly, give or take. And that totally blew me away. I mean, that was one of those albums that soon became one of my 10 out of 10 albums with its versatility and all that stuff. And from that on, I started to check out the band. Really didn't go back to the early albums back then. But, it was kind of like, wow, this kind of music exists, coming from a background that featured quite different names back then. mostly bigger bands, obviously. And bands were more like having thrash metal elements, but there were also some, proper death metal names. There were bands like Panther and stuff like that. So Heads of Sanity was something quite new back then. It was melodic death metal, but not only that. There was, flirting with black metal. There was definitely old school death metal present and all that stuff. And soon when expanding the knowledge on the band was like, wow, this is something totally different. As things turned out, my musical taste went more extreme side, and things like Heads of Sanity kind of got forgotten, and then I eventually even sold some of the albums away. I think pretty much all I had. Don't ask me why. I don't have an exact answer for that. So it was quite nice to come back to this band after basically decades. And man, I rarely feel nostalgic, but when I was listening to some older stuff, that's really what got me going. So that's for the introduction of my story with Heads of Sanity, and I will get into more of those into more detailed level, if you will, when going through. But this time I am trying to do in these two versions. First of all, I'll go quickly through the discography in the way chronological order how the albums came out, and then I will be selecting my own worst to best for these albums. I don't know if it makes sense. For me, it certainly does, because there's a lot of changes with this band, not so much with a lot of other bands which are more or less the same, similar consistency throughout the years. So, Heads of Sanity is one of those older names that started already in the late 80s. Basically the same era and age as bands like Entombed and the like, which is another band that totally changed their style during the course of action. And sometimes they can be a really blessing in disguise. There are probably a lot of people who like Metallica for changing from Kill 'Em All to something more easily to digest kind of a music. And then there are these fans who are like, okay, they betrayed us because they changed so much. So when Heads of Sanity finally got to do their first album, Nothing But Death Remains, it was old school death metal the way things were back then. You can definitely hear the kind of 1980s sound and feel with the early steps of death metal. They weren't exactly very early to the party, especially when a lot of American names were there from basically like mid-80s to do old school death metal. Florida sound was very, very much already right there by the time Heads of Sanity came to the party. But when we're talking about Swedish death metal, we could say Heads of Sanity is definitely one of the early birds. After a few demos, and look at this, it's a very active phase from 1989 to 1990. 4 demos basically. Well, obviously some are rehearsals, but still, this is how bands operated back days, and I still think they should do that. Do a lot of demoing and rehearsal tapes and whatever, and pick the best pieces and then move on to debut album. Unlike a lot of other bands nowadays do. They first found a band and maybe a year or two later, without demos and whatnot, they have this first album out and they're like, hey, yeah, we have an album out. And the outcome is quite mediocrity. anyway, this old first album is exactly old school death metal, and for both good and bad. Let's get into my personal order in a little bit, but that was the first stepping stone for Edge of Sanity, and nothing as groundbreaking. When Unorthodox came out only a year later, things started to change. They added melodies and things were suddenly having more like a personality. It was like a different band altogether, yet at the same time sounding old school. So there was, in my opinion, a big step up, a lot of illusion going on with the band, and Edge of Sanity was really, really shaping up. Now, when, again, a year later, Spectral Sorrows came out, there barely was this kind of old school death metal anymore present. I mean, certainly it is, but it's more about melodic death metal, or melodic metal like some people would say. And this 1993 era is roughly the one that basically goes hand in hand with a lot of bands of roughly same style. Bands like In Flames and Dark Tranquility, Greats of Ishar and stuff like that. So suddenly this kind of a whole melodic death metal movement started to emerge. Also, Hypocrisy was right there around this era with its more melodic outputs. So there was these winds of change, if you will. So a lot of bands went for more melodic stuff. Also, you might remember how Entombed started to add more rock and rollish elements and kind of abandoned their old school sound after 2 albums. And for Edge of Sanity, it meant like after 2 albums. There is this saying among reviewers that the 3rd album is the hard one or the challenging one, because after you done the initial work with the first album and then you kind of hone it a little bit more or take a twists and turns with the 2nd album, the 3rd one kind of defines as if you have any kind of a clue what you're doing, or if there's a new style or whatever, or maybe you go back to the roots. It's kind of these crossroads, and for certainly Edge of Sanity, it is exactly that. Spectral Sorrows is clearly once again a step forward from the old school sound and abandoning a lot of their past. When Purgatory Africa once again, a year later came on, it was more like honing this new wave of Edge of Sanity. Lots of melodic parts were happening. There was more grooviness, catchiness, but also diversity. You could hear some black metal parts included on the album, and as it is, it's quite different. Like I said when I was introduced to the band, I was kind of blown away because a lot of things were happening there, but with proper vocals. There were like proper growly vocals. There were these raspy black metal vocals. There were faster parts. Then there was catchier, even cheesy parts with some of the songs. So a lot of things were happening, and in my opinion, Unorthodox kind of paved the way for Spectral Sorrows as much as it paved the way for Purgatory Africa. And in Spectral Sorrows there are songs that, or actually one song that is very much like non-metal, non-death metal in any ways. And so there was the second phase of Edge of Sanity happening. And mind you, this only happened in a span of 5 years. So there were a lot of things going on. By the time band went for Crimson, you could clearly hear that they were abandoning kind of a death metal altogether. I mean, it was more like a progressive death metal in that sense. So while there are growler vocal parts and all that stuff present, it doesn't really feel like a death metal release in that ways. 40 minutes, basically one track, and trying to figure out what's going on here. Doing something very majestic, very challenging, but also kind of progressive. Some would say it's kind of an experimental death metal, or just experimental extreme metal, if you will. And only extreme because of those growly vocals and all that stuff. Music-wise, composition-wise and all that stuff, not so death metallic if you really think about it. But those melodic death metal parts were very, very much present there. So, yeah, it's an interesting choice once again. It's like a 3rd chapter in the Book of Edge of Sanity suddenly opened. And when they came to Inferno a year later, things were like taking another turn for the lighter side of melodic metal. You can hear a lot of Crimson kind of elements there, or even Purgatory Africa, but it's even less of a death metal thing. It's more like Edge of Sanity's version of what Entombed was doing with their more like a death and roll, and it's interesting because at the same time it kind of tries to be very catchy and kind of a mainstreamish metal. At the same time, it's also lacking those hit songs, which would have been a requirement for bigger success, at least if you ask me. Then something totally different happened. During the same year came the album Cryptic, which doesn't even feature Dan Svano, one of the most important names of the whole band. And that's why you see these double photo on Metal Archives. 1997 lineup doesn't even feature Dan Svano at all. So it's like an entirely different band, but obviously there are old band members right there. And Svano was doing something else. The result, a horrible one, which doesn't even sound like Edge of Sanity. Poor in production, poor in songwriting, something horrible. Even the logo is different. So it was like a very weird spin-off. And by the time 1999, the band was gone. So all these albums came in a span of 10 years only. Basically even less if you really think about it, that Nothing But Death Remains came out in 1991 and Cryptic 1997. So less than 10 years if you really think about the whole era of the band. But from 1989 to 1999, the band was right there. And suddenly no more. Until Crimson 2 by Dan Svano and some guest musicians came out in 2003, which explains these years here in Metal Archives as well. So it was like a comeback, but for one album only. And to kind of conclude the whole era. Kind of a weird choice, but if you really think about it, because Cryptic is a horrible album, well, not horrible, but awfully lukewarm mediocrity with a kind of a bad production, I understand why there had to be this kind of a swan song of an album to finish the whole era with something more decent. So by this time you already know which would be my pick when we're talking about the worst of Edge of Sanity and going towards the best one. So with Cryptic, I would say this doesn't even deserve what it's saying here on average 62%. I would say this is closer to 5 out of 10. First of all, like I said, it has quite poor production, given that the band had been out there for many, many years. This is something that would sound like the first album of a demo band that had only a couple of demos and then boom, moving on to a debut album. First of all, lots of these songs are out just totally lukewarm, mediocre, very forgettable. Basically, there are no good single riffs on this album. Everything is at least, even in its best, kind of like okay-ish. I can live with it, but they're not good. And by the worst part, I'm like, what the hell are these guys doing? As if they're scraping the worst parts, laying around the floor, and like, hey, let's make an album out of this. I don't know what's the background story, and that goes beyond the scope of this video, but yeah, it's an album that should have not been made, at least under the name of Edge of Sanity. There's no reason for that to go back. I went through it twice before making this video, and I kind of feel I'm regretting that. It's not a good album on any standards. It's just kind of horrible. Then it becomes more tricky, and I'm kind of having a hard time to pick the correct order, because there's like 3 albums which are basically on the same level of being quite lukewarmish and not exactly great. And I'm kind of bound to go all the way back to Nothing But Death Remains. By no means, it's not a bad album. It's very typical death metal debut album in the sense that it has all the right ingredients, maybe not the right amount of seasoning, and it's very, very basic first step death metal album. Like, you had those My First Sony kind of a recording device with a microphone and a few buttons, and that is sometimes used as a kind of a meme material to describe some band's first demo and all that stuff. It's like a kid's toy for recording material. And in that sense, Edge of Sanity's debut album is much like that. My first death metal album. Like, you have the kind of a growly parts, okay-ish. You have those riffs, yeah, I guess you could go on with them. And the production, can't really complain. And of course, the time and all that stuff. It's like, yeah, I get it why you're doing that. But it's not exactly a great album. It's a listenable album, but something that I cannot cheer for. I mean, it's more like an album that is... You have to have it in order to have something in contrast and in comparison. But really, there is no reason for me to go back to it ever after doing this video. It's just very basic death metal album, old school ways. I think maybe some people need to hear it so they understand the course of evolution and progress. But beyond that, I don't know. It's not that great. And then it still is kind of a... tricky to figure out which one I would go. And there is maybe a tiny bit of nostalgia plays out, because I would actually say Crimson 2, which is, I see, somewhat highly praised. among some of the peers. This is an interesting release because it feels like eternity. I mean, it doesn't really go like that if you really think about the minutes. But it's also recycling elements from Crimson 1, or just Crimson. And the thing here is, it's kind of the same kind of progressive melodic death metal kind of a combination, or a little of a mismatch, but it doesn't have the great structure that the original one had. Also, because of these recycled parts, I feel like all the best parts are coming from the original Crimson one. And this seems more like going back, but I don't have the magic. Maybe because I didn't even listen to it back in the days when it was released. And that was because I was so much disappointed with Inferno and Cryptic. So when I was listening to it now, 2022, when the album was released in 2003, all the production felt quite like obsolete. Not exactly today's sound, and not even like the best albums by Sanity having the production. Also, everything felt more like getting back to scraps. So it kind of makes more sense than the debut album, but it still feels more like unfinished work, if you will. So it's listenable, not exactly very enjoyable in my opinion. But like I said, a lot of people seem to have high praises for it. So maybe I'm just wrong. That is totally possible. Then I would go to 1997 with another album from that year, and that would be Inferno. This is, in my opinion, way better than Cryptic, a little bit better than Crimson 2 and the debut album, but not exactly great. Nothing that I would like to have in my collection anymore. I had it back in the days because I loved Purgatory Africa and I liked Crimson a lot. But Inferno felt like a letdown, and it still does to this day. Some of the best parts are like, hey, yeah, there's something really, really catchy and something that it's almost like a grower, but it isn't. So now that I was listening to it after a couple of decades, I guess, it felt like, yeah, this could have been a really good mini CD or MLP. But for an album, it feels like totally too lengthy, and the songs are not that good. And it lasts for almost 50 minutes. And it's kind of a drag for that much because, it's kind of a lukewarm experience in so many ways, which is why I totally understand it having review scores on average here, 63%. It's very close to what I would say. I mean, for me, 6.5 out of 10, 65% if you will. Not a bad one, but something that I feel like I need another couple of decades before going back, because by then I have probably forgotten it. And when I will go back, and I was like, yeah, I was right back in the day. 2022. So there's a reason why I totally, sold it. And then something which is totally loved by a lot of Earths of Sanity fans. It never clicked too much for me, and that is the Spectral Sorrows. The thing here is, it has quite a nice amount of ideas. There are a couple of hit songs like that Sacrifice, which doesn't even sound like a death metal song or even a metal song. There's a good Manowar cover, which is there to just kind of give these weird signals. I mean, some parts of the album are like old school death metal, quite okay so. And then you have these more melodic parts, which are like a little bit, okay, what's happening? This is going to a different direction. I mean, the band. And the album feels like it's pretty much all over. They have a lot of nice ideas, but they haven't yet found the way to execute it. That happened later on. And for me, Spectral Sorrows is only a 7 out of 10 album. I mean, there are plenty of nice ideas. And then there are plenty of ideas which I would have just, kind of removed. So it's an interesting choice. I know some people just absolutely love it. And I kind of understand it. But it's not working for me as well as it should be. And because of the variety and, the diversity with the songs, I mean, it's kind of a interesting trip to listen through it. But at the same time, it feels like there's just too much of that. So it's a little bit like not having very much focus on the album. Interesting release in so many ways, but not exactly doing the trick for me. And by this time, we have narrowed down to top 3, which are Unorthodox, Purgatory Africa, and Crimson. Now, I would say Unorthodox becomes the number 3 album on the list. Why so? Because here the band really nailed their old school sound. They had more catchy tunes and riffs, and the execution is right there. They also feature a little bit clean vocals, which were, I think, rather a rare thing. Synthesizers, like, wow, what's going on? And I think that's where the band showed that they have their own thing going on after the very basic debut album. And this is the direction, I guess, in hindsight, I would say I would love to see how the band would have become. You know, it's not as versatile as the ones later on, but it's way more death metallic than anything that came after all. I mean, it's probably the band's most death metal-like album, even topping the first album, because, I mean, this has more layers, more ideas, more fresh ideas, mind you. And it's actually quite good because of that. Even the production is more powerful. You know, everything is more powerful than with the debut album. So this was definitely going to some new direction. And I think this is, for that reason, better than Spectral Sorrows. But like I said, some people just like it when it became more melodic, which I can guess I kind of understand very well. And that's why the reason why Crimson is on my top 2 spot for Edge of Sanity. Now, this is a really interesting, because I remember it's only showed one track, 40 minutes. Exactly. Not a second less or above or anything like that. Just 40 minutes a track. And I was like, okay, what to expect? You used to back in the days, as if you were like me, like it's more like 8 to 12 songs, some 40 give or take minutes, maybe 30 minutes, maybe 50, close to that, but nothing like exactly 40 minutes and one track. And throughout this course, it's this very, very interesting release, because it goes all over the places. It's progressive, yes, it's experimental, but it's also kind of a bit metallic, yet having a lot of melodic parts. So while at the same time it kind of abandoned the death metal past of the band, it also still keeps one string going on, like, hey, we are not ready to let you go. And as such, it has these growlier parts and all that stuff. And also very, very catchy riffs. And it's an interesting, very ambitious project to have this one megalomaniac track and having it exactly 40 minutes. I can only imagine how much work it might have taken to figure it out, all the structure, the length, and, well, everything, all the details. It's an interesting release, which I can still enjoy to this day. It's not my favorite, though, for reasons I will soon explain, but definitely something that people should check out. I think it has, stood the test of time, because having this interesting structure and very, very good melodies and, well, vocal parts as well. But it's not so that metallic as people might be thinking of. Which brings me to the top 1 spot, Purgatory Africa, which was, getting me when I was like 19. So this is an interesting release, almost 45 minutes, and the classic, which I just described, 10 songs, 45 minutes. And man, I was blown away. But just because with the first track, which is 8 minutes, horrible thing to think nowadays, but when you have 8 minutes of a catchy song, it's a brilliant work. That song alone was enough to convince me that the whole album is just so great. Great vocals, great catchy tunes, production that is not exactly superior, but quite good, and the lyrics and everything was right there. I fell in love with this as a late teenager. There was something totally majestic with the album. There are a couple of weaker tracks, but that doesn't really ruin the experience. Nowadays, I would say, this is only 8 out of 10. I guess I kind of got fed of it, and maybe I got fed of melodic metal and melodic death metal in the first place. But back in the days, I really, really loved it. Like for example, like I said, this Twilight is the kind of a combination of these melodic death metal things. Then it goes for a little bit of a twist in black metal ways. Of Dark Summer Region is more like a black metal track. I mean, you have those screamer parts and darker riffs and all that stuff. Then it comes this kind of a hit song, which is then again more melodic death metal. Silent, it's good, but it seems kind of a filler, because Black Tears is one of the hit songs on this album. It's very lightweighted song. It's not a death metal song, but it's catchy as hell. It lasts only for 3 minutes. LSD, once again, a good song. Velvet Dreams, Enter Chaos. They're kind of a defining Edge of Sanity style. The kind of a trademark songs, if you will. Only by the last track, Song of Sirens, feels a little bit left off. Like it's as if the band was flirting with a little bit industrial. Not a bad track, but a little bit weird. But then again, lasts less than 3 minutes, so one could even consider it kind of an outro. All in all, I would say this is a good album. The production could be, especially in hindsight, a lot better. But the vocals, I still think that Ed Sanity has really, really good growly vocals. The riffs, really, really nice. Melodies, can really put a lot better than that. Well, Hypocrisy can be if you ask me, but that's a different story. So there's a lot of good things going on with this album, and I think this really got me to Edge of Sanity. If I have heard any of those other albums before this one, I don't know how much I would have checked the band back in the days, to be honest. But I still think if there's only like 3 albums you would hear from Edge of Sanity, they would be Purgatory Africa, Unorthodox, and Crimson. They're all quite different, yet at the same time they all define Edge of Sanity in a beautiful ways. And if you really need something else to toss in that way, well, the Spectral Sorrows, because it's a link between the old and new Edge of Sanity, if you will. So there's that. An interesting band for sure, and I think it's a band that totally deserves more attention. It's kind of a shame that their career lasted only for some 10 years and then it was gone, because who knows how much things they could have given, how much interesting ideas they would have been able to do with given time, more albums, better budget, and all that stuff. But I guess sometimes the brightest light lasts only for so long, and then it's a goner. But interesting band for sure. So in case you missed this old school important link in Swedish death metal history, there's still time to get back. At least by the time I was listening to this, it is all around Spotify and all, and of course other streaming services. So give it a listen, give it a go, and what can I say? I hope you like it. It's an interesting band for sure, not for everybody, guaranteed, but still worth a listen. Thanks for being with me, and should you have comments or questions regarding this video or topic, let me know and put them in the comments box below. Thanks for watching. Bye bye. See you soon.